When we're learning physiology, it's really important to have a clear understanding of gradients. Gradients are the basis for a lot of chemical reactions in the body. So we're going to start off by just talking about the gradients of sodium and potassium. So right here I've drawn a cell. To be clear, not all cells are circular like this, but for simplicity, I tend to draw cells as a circle like this. This purple line is representing the plasma membrane of the cell, and we'll talk about the intricacies and the characteristics of the cell membrane as we move forward. But the cell membrane is what's described as selectively permeable. Selectively permeable is suggesting that the cell allows certain things, or I should say the cell membrane, otherwise known as the plasma membrane, lets certain things into the cell and certain things out of the cell. For now, we're just going to deal with sodium and potassium. So sodium is going to look something like this. Na plus represents sodium, and I have drawn it like this, but I always draw it, or I try to always draw it, with brackets around it, because that is suggesting concentration. This would be read the sodium ion concentration. An ion is a charged atom, sodium ion concentration. Outside of the cell is what we refer to as the extracellular fluid. And inside the cell is what we refer to as the intracellular fluid. So there's always a much higher concentration of sodium outside of the cells than inside of the cells, or nearly so. There are exceptions to what I just said, but for the most part, we can assume that there's a much higher concentration of sodium outside of the cells than inside of cells. So with that in mind, I tend to draw sodium like this inside of cells. Now, if that's hard to see, that's okay. What I'm trying to reflect here is that there's a super high concentration of sodium outside of the cell and a low concentration or much lower concentration of sodium inside of cells. To be clear, we use the word concentration because it's just not the quantity of the entity we're talking about, whether it's a molecule like glucose or an ion like sodium. It is the ratio between the entity, in this case sodium, and the amount of water in the space. In this case, the space here is the extracellular fluid, and in this case, the space is the intracellular fluid or the cytoplasm within the cell. Okay, so what we have right here is a much higher concentration of sodium outside of the cell and a much lower concentration of sodium inside of the cell. This is where gradients play a part. That is to say, entities, in this case sodium, is going to move down its chemical gradient. The chemical we're talking about is sodium. It's moving down its chemical gradient just like a ball rolling downhill. This is a passive process, meaning it does not require energy. Sodium moves into the cell down its chemical gradient. To be very clear, I briefly mentioned that the plasma membrane is selectively permeable, and for sodium to move into the cell, it requires a channel. For simplicity, I'm not drawing the channel right now. We'll talk about channels in a subsequent video. So sodium will move passively into the cell down its chemical gradient from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And to be clear, that is also describing the process of diffusion. Diffusion is the passive movement. Passive means it does not require energy. It is the passive movement of sodium from an area of high concentration to low concentration. And let me re-articulate that. Diffusion is the movement of anything within the universe from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration. If a skunk sprays its odorant molecules, those odorant molecules move from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration. The higher concentration is when the odorant molecules are immediately emitted from the skunk, and those odorant molecules then move to areas of lower concentration. Diffusion has a limited distance that it can travel. That's why if a skunk sprays its odorant molecules, you actually can smell it for quite a distance, but you're not going to smell it from a mile away. And that's the same thing within our body. Things like sodium can only diffuse a limited or a certain distance away from where it's moving from. In this case, sodium is moving or diffusing down its chemical gradient into the cell. A chemical gradient is the exact same thing as a concentration gradient. That is to say, we have a high concentration of sodium right here and a low concentration of sodium right here. That is sodium's chemical gradient from an area of high concentration outside of the cell to an area of lower concentration inside the cell. We have another ion known as potassium. K plus represents potassium. And there's always, or nearly always, a super high concentration of potassium inside of cells and a much lower concentration of potassium outside of cells. So what do you think it's going to do? If you said leave the cell or diffuse out of the cell, you're exactly right. It's going to move passively out of the cell down its chemical gradient or down its concentration gradient. So potassium's chemical gradient in most cells in the body is going to favor it moving out of the cell to an area of lower concentration. One thing I do want to point out is that I have this arrow moving down for sodium, and I have this arrow moving up kind of to the side for potassium. It doesn't matter the direction of the arrow. I am reticent to always put an arrow for something moving down its gradient into a cell down like that. But what I'm showing here is this arrow is going up, and it's just going up because in this case, presumably that's where the channel is. Now, to be clear, there's one more factor we need to talk about with gradients, and those are the electrical gradients. Okay, so when we're talking about electrical gradients, we need to understand that there's a differential in charge in most body cells from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. That is to say, the interior of a resting cell tends to be negative, and the exterior tends to be positive, and we will draw it something like this. Okay, so this is what the charge looks like in resting cells within the body. That is to say, there tends to be a slight negative charge within cells and a slight positive charge outside of cells. Our human body is electrically neutral. It has no charge. But with respect to cells, there's a slight positive charge just on the outside of the plasma membrane and a slight negative charge on the inside. For now, we don't need to worry about what the exact voltage is within the cell, but just understand this is what a cell looks like. If we go back to sodium, we have that super high concentration of sodium outside of the cell and a much lower concentration of sodium inside the cell. Now, we've already talked about sodium wanting to move into this cell down its chemical gradient from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. But there's another feature within the cell that is attracting sodium into the cell, and that is the negative charge within the interior of the cell membrane. Within chemistry, in physics, in the natural world, opposite charges are attracted to each other. So the positive charge on sodium is attracted to the negative charge within the interior of the cell. So that is also incentivizing or attracting sodium to move into the cell. And because of that, we say sodium has two types of gradients. It has a chemical gradient or concentration gradient. Keep in mind, sodium is the chemical. Sodium has a chemical gradient, but it also has an electrical gradient. That is to say, sodium moves passively into cell down its electrochemical gradient. Sodium has two things incentivizing it to move into the cell passively. It's electrochemical gradients. Now, if we look at potassium on the other hand, potassium, once again, looks like this. Potassium has a positive charge as well. A positive charged atom is known as a cation, whereas a negative charged atom like chloride is known as an anion. So we've also said there's a much lower concentration of potassium outside of cells. Potassium has a chemical gradient, as we displayed previously, to leave the cell down its chemical gradient. It's going to move passively out of the cell. But it does not have an electrical gradient favoring it to leave the cell. Whereas opposite charges are attracted to each other, positive charges are actually repelled by each other. So based on an electrical gradient, potassium would actually prefer to stay in the cell where it's actually negative. Potassium's positive, the interior of the cell membrane is negative. But because potassium has such a large chemical gradient, it disregards the fact that it doesn't want to be around the positive charge on the outside of the cell. So potassium is still leaving the cell. As such, and for this reason, we say potassium only has a chemical gradient favoring it to leave a resting cell, whereas sodium has an electrochemical gradient. The concepts of gradients are really important to understand within physiology because they are going to be the basis of a lot of things that happen within the cell, whether we're talking about muscle cells, nerve cells, and a bunch of other cells in the body. For example, the pancreatic beta cells, that is to say, cells within our pancreas that release insulin, are known as beta cells. And this is a basis for a lot of the activity that happens in the beta cells that leads to the release of insulin. And we'll talk about that in a subsequent video.